My name is Katrina Scott, and I am the Director of the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. Welcome to today's webinar on Preventing Intimate Partner Homicide, Reflections from Members of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, Part 1. The Learning Network is a knowledge mobilization initiative that bridges the gap between current gender-based violence research, practice knowledge, and lived experience, and aims to strengthen the capacity of the gender-based violence sector and movement. The Knowledge Hub facilitates a trauma and violence-informed community of practice for projects conducting intervention programming and research for people who've experienced family violence. This project is funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. To learn more about the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub, please access the website links posted in the chat. This webinar has also been co-hosted and shared through the Awareness to Action project in the family violence and family law area. The Center's work in this area is designed to increase the capacity of family law professionals to better recognize, address, and assess and address the impact of abuse in the family court, and to improve the experiences of adult and survivor and child survivors and victims of family violence. Once again, to learn more, you can access the link in the chat. On behalf of all of those projects, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehouk, and Chinongtong nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today, this land continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We make this land acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous lands and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. Acknowledgement and action to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada is of particular importance when discussing deaths in the context of gender-based violence, as we're doing today. Indigenous Canadians face substantially greater risks of being killed in acts of gender-based violence. These realities underline the need to work collaboratively to recognize colonization and its impacts and address continued oppressions. On this, I also want to mention that there is a report being prepared by the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee that examines Indigenous deaths in particular, which we look forward to profiling when it's ready. I also wanted to take a moment before we get started to acknowledge the immense and irreversible loss of life due to domestic homicide. We'd like to honor the memory of those who've been killed and the devastating impact their deaths have had on their families, friends, and communities. Their lives were valuable. Their stories are a crucial part of understanding this issue. We dedicate this webinar to them, and we commit to continue to learning from tragedies of the past to build a safer future. And with that in mind, I also want to say to you to be aware that this webinar focuses on intimate partner homicide. Presenters may share details of cases and talk about what's needed in terms of change. Some of this content might be difficult. Please care for yourself in whatever way feels right. Take breaks or step away or reach out for support at any time. If you wish for support during the webinar, a list of supports and services is available via the link posted in the chat. A support person is also available for anonymous text-based assistance during the event. You can reach them at the number which will be posted in the chat, which is 883-343-0186. So with that, I'd like to welcome our presenters for today. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by um, Erin Lee, Dr. Carolyn Fraser, and Eva Zachary, all of whom are members of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. Erin also currently serves as Director of Lanark County Interval House and Community Support. She's an experienced, passionate advocate who spent decades working to end violence against women. Carolyn Fraser was a sworn constable with the London Police Service for 15 years, and since 2017 has served at the Ontario Police College as the resident subject matter expert on domestic violence. And Eva Zachary is the Executive Director of the Muskoka Victim Services and a longtime advocate for survivors, with more than 15 years of experience in conflict resolution, crisis intervention, victim advocacy, and community collaboration. Karen, Erin, and Eva all are going to be speaking on as contributors to 3 themed chapters of the Domestic Violence Death Committee report that is soon to come out. You can find more information and their full bios in the chat. So just before I invite our 2 speakers to present, I wanted to give a tiny bit of context about the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee and mention just a few of its major findings. So Ontario's Domestic Violence Death Review Committee started in 2003, and it is actually one of the longest standing DVDRCs in the world. The role of this committee is to review all homicides that involve the death of a person and or his or her children committed by a person's partner or ex-partner from an intimate relationship. So that's the definition used by the coroner's office to locate or to identify the deaths that are going to be reviewed by this multidisciplinary committee. So when those are available, what happens is the committee takes a look at the cases, all of the information about it, reviews these deaths, and tries to make recommendations to prevent further or future deaths. In June of 2002, the Office of the Chief Coroner issued a call for members for the DVDRC, and there was a public process to identify suitable candidates for the newly constituted multidisciplinary committee. 15 members were appointed to the committee, some new, some continuing, along with 2 resource members. And these members represent Ontario's diverse communities and come from frontline services, academia, public safety, and the legal field. The webinar we're doing today reflects the experiences and views of individual members serving on the DVDRC. It does not necessarily represent the views of the Office of the Chief Coroner or of the committee as a whole. We are going to be talking about chapters, and the final report based on this work is due to come out later this fall. Just before we go into details about specific forms and reviews, I wanted to talk to you about a couple major findings. When we look at DVDRC cases over 10 years, when we look at cases reviewed between 2010 and 2020, what we know is that most of the perpetrators, those in 87% of the cases, are men. Women are most frequently victims, and that 75% of cases include 7 or more risk factors that can be retrospectively identified. This has led to over 400 recommendations. We recently did a summary of those recommendations, and you can see here that they come in the area broadly of education and training, collaboration and coordination. There's some recommendations around policy programs and legislations, and also ones around risk assessment, risk management, and safety planning. With the newly formed DVDRC, one of the decisions we made is that given that we have some general findings and recommendations, it's important for us to be more specific. How can we understand the experiences of particular groups and get at the recommendations needed to prevent particular kinds of domestic homicide? So this is what we are going to do today. We're going to look at three major chapters of the DVDRC report that will come out this fall. We're going to talk about what we need to do to prevent intimate partner homicide in aging populations, look at intimate partner homicides committed by firearms, and examine mental health and substance use as intersections with intimate partner homicide. Three more chapters will be coming out in part 2 of this webinar on November 27th. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Erin.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Good afternoon, everybody. My chapter is referred to by me titled Often Forgotten Elder Aging Femicide. And when I say often forgotten, it's because often we don't think about aging and our older population as at risk of victimization from violence. We often think about and make excuses for why that type of violence might be happening or being referenced based on memory loss, based on natural progression of life, and those types of things. So that's why my reference is often forgotten. We can forward to the next slide, please. I'd like to share just a little bit about what is commonly known about elder violence in Ontario. And I think that it's important to note that femicide in Ontario, 1 in 5 women murdered from 1974 to 2012 was 55 years or older. This statistic highlights the significant number of older women who were killed, indicating that gender-based violence exists across the life course. Prevention of Elder Abuse reports that in 2019, a Canadian prevalence study revealed that 7.5% of older adults experience mistreatment. If we shift over to the other side and we look at it in 2020, nearly 2/3, 64% of senior victims of police-reported violence were victimized by someone other than a family member or intimate partner. Acquaintances were implicated for more than 1 in 4, that's 28%. And senior women who experienced police reported violence were twice as likely to have been victimized by an intimate partner compared with senior men. And that looks at 16% of women versus 7% of men. So it is happening across our country and across our province. If we could forward the slide, please. When it comes to elder femicide, what do we need to consider and what do we need to think about as people who are doing death reviews, but also people who are engaged with senior populations in community? We need to consider long-term relationships. Often we know that there are new relationships, so later in life relationships where somebody's met well after they've had children, isolation and the reality of isolation, how much access they might have to their family, to their children and their grandchildren, notions of suicidal ideation, potential suicide pacts between an aging couple, assumptions related to aging, so memory challenges, generalization of silence, right? It's not something that we talk about often. In some generations, violence and intimate partners is something that we still don't hear that much about, but we know that there is trauma and that people carry that trauma over the lifespan of their existence. Cultural beliefs and traditions. We need to consider the cultural context and the intersections that happen in people's lives. And we need to think about how we use this information and consider these pieces when we're working with older folks in our community. Limited neighbor engagement. In many cases that I've reviewed, there has been very limited neighbor engagement. And it's really important to think about who are their neighbors, who are their support systems, what does their circle look like? Faith-based understanding of intimate partner violence, that is something that we must think about as it relates again to the intersections of people's lives, especially in mixed race communities and mixed race couples. We need to definitely think about how faith impacts people's choices and the understanding of intimate partner violence. Sudden change in behaviors that are connected to health. Often we underestimate and we don't plan around people's safety as it relates to memory loss. We think about memory loss from a cognitive perspective when we don't think about it necessarily as a escalated potential change in behavior that often happens with patients who are experiencing memory challenges. Rationalizing that it's all because they're getting old. Right. You know what? That's just happening because mom's getting older. It's happening. It's natural. This stuff happens. People are more grouchy, rationalizing all the types of behaviors and observations we have and connecting that just to things that make us feel better and more comfortable in terms of the family members that we're navigating with. Risk to potential care and placement if violence is assessed in. I've reviewed cases where there were workers that were aware of the escalated behavior, but they didn't want to formally report it because it might risk their placement in them getting into a long care home and a facility. So really thinking about the risk that that creates for people when we don't assess violence in and not assessing violence at any juncture of care, never having the conversation about violence, and those pieces are really important for us to take away with us today in terms of integrating those pieces in any assessments and interactions and interventions we're having with our aging community. Please forward the slide, Esther. What are some of the common elements? So I will tell you that since becoming a member of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, the highest percentage of my cases are actually homicides or femicides in aging communities. And these are some of the common elements that you might be surprised about. No evidence of violence. So nothing shared with family or friends about any kind of indicators that there was violence going on. No suspicion from family members or neighbors or friends. They seemed fine. They seemed to be getting along well. There were no particular issues of notice. No history of violence. No police or law engagement. So often these couples have no history of violence. There's been no engagement with police or law enforcement. And if there has, it's been very, very recent. Lots of cases where memory challenges are certainly a part of the factors that have led to increased escalated behavior. Mental health issues, including depression, including isolation, including over exaggerated response to what would normally be considered within the norm, allegations and escalation of reaction. So, I believe that my partner is having an affair with the person at my church because they interact more, which previously would have been quite within the norm, and now it's escalated in terms of that suspicion and not necessarily being rational. So many mental health challenges, aging, the she wouldn't be able to live without me, those notions of how dependency works in terms of aging couples and couples who have been together for 40, 50 or more years. That person wouldn't be able to live without me as part of the scenario justifying why the behavior was escalated to include death. Suicidal ideation, thinking about suicide pact concerns and making sure that we are considering those realities because they were some of the elements of the cases that I've reviewed since becoming a member and other past cases in terms of looking at recommendations. If we could forward the slide, please. So where are the intersections? Where could we be engaging and seeing these intersections and intervening and perhaps having an opportunity to have more safety planning and more awareness created in families and in services? Hospital stay or illness, doctor's appointments, it is important that we think about how we discharge people, who we discharge them to, what the family planning aspect looks like, what is the support circle, and are we talking about these kinds of realities? Are we talking about violence? Are we talking about escalation of violence and the potential of that? How are we safety planning? Faith engagement, in many of the cases, there is a very close relationship with the family and faith groups. Really important to think about, are we inserting aging and violence in intimate partner relationships, in elder relationships, into our faith organizations, into the messages we're delivering? Service engagement, if they go to a community center, play bridge, play bingo, do other things, have high teas. Are we engaging and servicing and sharing that information? It's really critical that we're doing that, because these are the intersections where people can actually have access. Cultural communities, very important that we are building trusting relationships in cultural communities so that we can create that level of awareness. Social groups, neighbors, and think about location. Think about if people are living isolated, if they're living in their homes on their own. What are their locations? What are their locations? What are their finances? What do they have access to? Who are their POAs? Who are the restrictions? What are the restrictions and the realities about the family dynamic, and understanding trauma from history, especially when it's a blended family and the couple is relatively later in life kind of relationship? Really thinking about all of those realities, children and family members, and how they communicate, and who says what to whom, and how are we inserting ourselves in those conversations to provide support and ensure that we are doing the best we can to plan. Please advance the slide. As a result, there has been some missed opportunities through my review process. There's been some missed opportunities to assess violence in and to safety plan. Some of the places that I've already referenced in the previous slide: medical engagement for sure, home support. There is no point in being silent about violence when you're providing home support for risk of placement, because the risk is greater if left in those situations. Making sure that we're making available resource information, like information about the safety supports, the senior safety line, or the supports available through neighbors, friends, and family. Really thinking about how do we share that information in ways that our aging community can respect and understand. Why and how? We have to meet each person on their own to check in. We can't always rely on doing things in couples. Maybe we have to revert back a little bit to the kitchen counseling approach, where we're talking about knitting, and then we insert a little bit of information related to violence and ask questions that are specific about violence, including violence as a standard assessment. We need to make sure that with our senior folks that we're including violence as a standard part of all of our assessments, and naming those changes or observations in the behavior, and asking about, have you seen anything different? Are you noticing anything different? Anything different you wanted to talk about today, so that we're constantly engaging and doing that with family. So the next slide, if we could advance, really starts to talk about recommendations to consider. So recommendation to the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. This is about education, this is about tools, and thinking about create course curriculum that's uniquely focused on safety, violence, and risk, that speaks to history of and current intimate partner violence, suicide risk, family engagement, change of behavior, where aging and memory loss is relevant. Mimicking the assessment tools used in pediatric medicine, and as an additional support to geriatric testing, a specific health and wellness assessment to be created and implemented that identifies and is inclusive of an intersectional approach to risk, safety, and threat of violence. For the Ministry of Long-Term Care, as well as the Solicitor General, regarding policing, that wellness check procedures in both long-term health and policing are modified and shared in terms of areas assessed, safety planning, risk, and all of the other pieces that I've already talked about. It is important that we think about what our act of intervention is going to be to support with the intersectionality of people and aging. Next slide, please. Again, further in terms of recommendations to the Minister of Seniors and Accessibility, build on and prioritize a reframing campaign that builds on amplifying value, engagement, reduction of barriers to service, reducing isolation, and promoting reasons to live and thrive as folks age. Balanced this approach must be risk assessment alternatives to living with terminal illness or capacity loss, as well as couple care and family engagement supports. Almost lastly, to the Ministry of Health, specifically in the Ontario Hospital Association of Mental Health, review all training tools, including mental health first aid and processes related to suicide assessment and intervention, with a real big focus on looking at fantasy resolutions, plans, harm to self or others, thinking about family, thinking about the aging factors, what's within the norm of aging and the spectrum, and what would be contributing factors that might contribute to intimate partner violence happening in the relationship. If you could move to the next slide, please. I have done my very best to make this presentation as short as possible in terms of highlighting what I think is definitely the most important for you to consider. And I look forward to the full report being released to the community, and I look forward to having more conversations related to elder femicide. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'd like to pass it on, please, to Carolyn Fraser.
That was great. Thank you so much, Erin, for sharing that information with us. Before I get started, I just again want to say good afternoon to everyone and welcome again. My name is Carolyn Fraser. And before I get started, I really want to acknowledge Dr. Katrina Scott, my friends at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women, the Learning Network, and the Knowledge Hub for hosting this webinar. I also want to express my gratitude for all of you who've taken time out of your busy day to learn a little bit more about what the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee does, and specifically about these themed reports that we are reporting on today. So today I will be speaking and reporting on domestic violence homicides by firearms in Ontario. So when we think about gun violence, we often think about gang crime, mass shootings. However, in Canada, the deadliest form of gun violence actually happens behind closed doors in homes between intimate partners. The purpose of my presentation today, I want to highlight how firearm ownership and access to firearms in the context of intimate partner violence poses a significant risk to victims. I also want to share some details and information that we learned from the cases that we reviewed. And more importantly, before I leave, I want to provide some practical information that you can take to intervene if you suspect a person is experiencing a relationship that is abusive, and especially if the perpetrator has access or possession of firearms. Firearms are a lethal use of force, but the presence of firearms in an abusive household doesn't have to be fired to be dangerous. It's a symbol of ultimate control. Abusers use threats to induce fear by telling their victim that they will kill themselves if they ever leave them, that they will kill the victim, their children, their pets. They also will hold weapons during an argument or leave weapons displayed in the home as a constant reminder in an intimidation tactic to prevent the victim from leaving their situation safely. This situation creates a chronic terror that amplifies fear and maintains the power and control imbalance between the couple. According to Canadian studies and reports, including the recent Renfrew County Coroner's Inquest and the final report for the Mass Casualty Commission, gun ownership is the single greatest risk factor for IPV becoming fatal. It's not a history of violence or even prior death threats. Why is this? It's because the permanent presence of the weapon in the home and the accessibility of it. It's a weapon of opportunity. So whether the homicide was premeditated or whether it was an active fit of rage, a lot of these IPV homicides occur during a quarrel, an argument, or a fit of jealousy. So having them accessible and close by provides an opportunity. And certainly they are immediate lethal, they have an immediate lethal effect. So it's not surprising that in these cases, the lethality increases by 5 times. Part of the issue that I want to impart today is that the cases that we reviewed, most of these firearms were legally owned rifles and shotguns. People knew that there was abuse in the relationship, and authorities knew as well. And I will talk a little bit more about that in the findings from the case reviews. When we take a closer look at what's happening in Ontario, where firearms are used in the context of IPV, the data suggests that firearms are involved in a quarter of the IPV homicide cases, and they account for 29% of all deaths from 2002 to 2023. Access and possession of firearms is tracked as a risk factor by the Domestic Violent Death Review Committee when we conduct our reviews. So there's a 41 risk factor checklist for lethality that we will go through. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, in 419 of these cases, the presence of a firearm, whether it was used or not, was present in 26% of the time. For this particular report, we reviewed 9 intimate partner homicide cases. 4 cases were from 2022 to 2023, and an additional 5 cases from 2020 to 2021 were included to provide a more comprehensive analysis of the issue. What was interesting is that in most of the cases reviewed, perpetrators' access to firearms were known by authorities, like I just mentioned. In 3 of the cases reviewed, there was evidence that the perpetrator had or likely had current licenses to possess firearms. In another 2 cases, the perpetrators had previously been required to relinquish their firearms due to concerns about their risk to others, but still had access. In 1 case, the perpetrator's firearms license had expired, but still had access to their gun as it was not removed. Overall, there appeared to be a general absence of follow-up and accountability regarding concerns about firearm ownership and access. I apologize, I'm not sure my cursor got away from me. Sorry about that. What we've learned from the IPV homicide cases reviewed is that when domestic homicides involve the use of firearm, there are more fatalities. So in 5 of the 9 cases we reviewed, it actually was a homicide suicide where the perpetrator killed themselves just after they killed their partner, or they died shortly after through interactions with police. Beyond the 60% increase in homicide suicides in the case that were reviewed, there were many innocent children that were also killed as well. There were 3 young mothers, including one who was pregnant, and a total of 7 children under the age of 16 who were killed. There was also 1 adult son that died as well, protecting their mother. Often when children are killed in the context of IPV, they're killed by the perpetrator in an act of revenge, a master plan to annihilate the entire family, or children intervene by trying to protect the victim. IPV homicides have a devastating impact on children survivors. Children lose their parents. They're often present at the scene, or they're the ones that find the aftermath and the horror of the crime scene that is left. In one of the cases that we reviewed, a mother's 4-year-old child was the one to alert their neighbor of their mother's death. Another finding that supports current statistics is firearm-involved domestic homicides are more likely to occur in rural areas than urban areas. And according to Stats Canada, the incidence of femicide by firearm are particularly high in rural areas where both the risk of gender-based violence and access guns are greater. There's also additional barriers such as isolation and lack of services that make it difficult for the victim to leave their situation safely. When we look at firearm distribution per capita, rural per capita ownership of guns is almost double that of urban areas. So there's approximately 4,500 per 100,000 versus 2,500 per 100,000 of guns that are in the respective areas. We can presume that there's a greater number of long guns in rural areas due to the very nature of the geographical location and the way of life of rural, remote, and northern areas of the province. where hunting can be used for sustenance and or for employment. This graph just shows you the proportion of firearms deaths by firearms type. And as you can see, long guns such as shotguns and rifles were used in approximately 55% of the cases. Age also turns out to be a factor in firearm-related IP homicides. Older adults between the ages of 45 to 64 and 65 and older are proportionally targeted for firearms deaths opposed to non-firearm deaths. 3 of the cases that we reviewed involved couples over the age of 70. In these cases, issues of access to firearms had not been raised previously, but in the months leading up to the deaths, there were many risk factors and reasons for professionals to raise concerns about the potential dangers of access to firearms. After conducting a case review, one of the responsibilities of committee members is to generate recommendations. These recommendations are not an exercise of blame or to point fingers. It's to help to prevent further tragedies from happening. I like to use one of my favorite quotes from the famous poet and civil rights activist Maya Angelou to capture the essence of the spirit of what these recommendations are intended to do. As Maya Angelou would say, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So as a result of the 9 cases that were reviewed, 13 recommendations to various organizations, professional associations, and the government, focusing on missed opportunities and prevention associated with greater recognition in response to the risk firearms pose in cases of intimate partner violence. How you can help. So before I leave this presentation, I want to, again, give you some practical information. So what I suggest is, for starters, ask, get curious. I don't mean this to be an interrogation of the person or an inquest, but ask the person, do you or your partner or extended family or close friends possess firearms? Where are the firearms stored? Does the abuser have access to firearms at the home, or are they off property? Has the abuser ever mentioned about wanting to obtain a firearm or is in the process of obtaining a firearms license? And lastly, do you have concerns about the partner's mental health status? Are they suffering from depression? Have they ever said, if you ever leave me, I will kill myself? So certainly if anything that comes as, that you have a terrible feeling in your stomach and there's imminent danger, then I highly suggest you call 911 for help through law enforcement. Also, too, I'm a firm believer that knowledge is power. So one of the best ways to prevent intimate partner violence is to educate yourself on the dynamics of intimate partner violence, the control and power tactics that abusers use, and the risk factors for recidivism and lethality. There's a couple other processes that I want to share with you today if you're not already familiar with them. And these are Bill C-21, pretty recent legislation from the federal government, specifically red flag and yellow flag laws. And I will get into that in the next slide. There is also a course on the Canadian Police Knowledge Network, which is called Firearm Seizures in the Interest of Public Safety. And that has to do with public safety search warrants. And again, I will talk a little bit more about what that involves. So what is Bill C-21? So Bill C-21, officially titled An Act to Amend Certain Acts and to Make Certain Consequential Amendments, Firearms, received royal assent on December 15, 2023, enacting a range of firearm reforms, including national handgun freeze, red and yellow flag laws, and stronger trafficking penalties. So in the context of intimate partner violence, we're focusing on red and yellow flag laws because they are meant for harm reduction and enhancing safety for victims who are in a domestic violence situation. Also to note that many of the recommendations that were generated through this particular review were made in the context of the recent amendments to this federal legislation, specifically urging for more public awareness on how these changes relate to strengthening provisions for the protection of IPV survivors. Red flag laws. So red flag laws are intended to reduce harm through court processes that anyone can make an application to provincial territorial courts for two types of orders, depending on the situation. What I want you to take away from this particular slide is that anyone can apply for these court orders. It does not have to be a victim or survivor. It's done ex parte, which means the respondent is not present for the hearing. And 3, your identity can be protected through measures that the courts can take. So if you're worried about backlash, then there are measures to protect your identity. So the 2 court orders are, one is the emergency prohibition order to remove firearms. So you can remove firearms for up to 30 days from someone who may be a danger to themselves or others. The hearings can be set to be considered for a longer term prohibition for up to 5 years. And this other order is interesting. So emergency limitation on access orders. This one sets rules for another person's possession or use of firearms if there's a risk that their firearms could be accessed by someone who is already under a prohibition order. And what's important about this is that about 30% of the cases of domestic violence come to law enforcement attention. So the rest of the cases, law enforcement are not intervening. So the other part too is that the highest risk for lethality is usually during a recent separation and if there is a history of domestic violence. So when people are separating and the person's moving out of the home and there's a lot of conflict and they're residing at a friend's house or like the perpetrator staying at a friend's house, family, whatever, and that individual has access to firearms. So this helps ensure victim safety by making sure that there's some control in place when the victim is out of the house and in another residence or a place where they could potentially have access to firearms, and possibly maybe the firearms aren't stored safely so the perpetrator can again have access to them. The other is the yellow flag law, and this is sort of just a nice to know, but the chief firearm officers may temporarily suspend a firearms license for up to 30 days when doubts arise about the license holder's eligibility. So for example, suspected intimate partner violence. These suspensions provide time to evaluate whether full revocation is required. Now again, so when cases come to the attention of law enforcement has their own processes in place to trigger an alert to the CFO's office to get them to pay attention to a particular individual who poses a risk and they have access to firearms or possession of firearms. So what I want you to take away from this particular side is that the Chief Firearms Office is a regulatory entity. Their primary job is to keep firearms out of the hands of people who pose a risk to themselves or others. And the CFO is only as good as the information that is shared with them. So I've left their contact information, their phone number, and their email address, is that if you have any concerns, you can call and advise them that you have concerns about this person owning a firearm or having a license. And they will keep a documented file on that particular individual. And perhaps maybe it warrants an immediate hearing to revoke their license. Or perhaps it's sort of a nice to know and it's kept in their folder. And if there's enough history that is included in their folder, they might, they'll be able to use that information in the hearing to whether they want to revoke their license or whether they don't want to continue their license when they're eligible to be renewed. So again, the CFO is only as good as the information that is shared with them. So remember that. Bill C-21 also has other enhancements. And one of the enhancements as of April 4th of 2025, individuals on protection orders or convicted of violence against a partner or family member are automatically ineligible for a firearms license. Mandatory revocation. So the CFO must revoke licenses within 24 hours where there's reasonable grounds to suspect IPV, stalking, or when a protection order is issued. Firearms must be surrendered to authorities within 24 hours. And records and reporting. So courts must advise the CFO office within 24 hours of protection orders being made, buried, or revoked. And again, this is really important in closing the loop and sharing information and making sure the right agencies have the right information to do their job. Lastly, what I want to touch on is public safety search warrants. public safety search warrants have nothing to do with a criminal offense or criminality. These are warrants that are meant to protect the public. So if there's anyone at any time that is at risk to themselves or others and have access to firearms, this course of action can be pursued. And the reason why I put this slide in is that some law enforcement might not be familiar with public safety search warrants because it's not something that is maybe typically used. So for yourself as a citizen wanting to get firearms out of the hands of a particular individual, you can go to your police service, you can ask them and give them your concerns about a person having ownership of firearms, and the police officer can start an application for a warrant to search and seize these firearms in the interest of public safety. And certainly if it's a situation where it's immediate danger and it's not practical to get a warrant, then there's a provision where officers can search and seize without a warrant. So what I want you to take away from this slide is that there is a resource on the Canadian Police Knowledge Network, which is an e-learning platform. There's a course called Firearm Seizures in the Interest of Public Safety. This is a 45-minute long course, so not a big investment of your time. It's $33. It's in both official languages, and anybody can take this course. So if you take this course, you find out more about public safety search warrants and share that information with your colleagues, friends, and neighbors. Lastly, what I would like to round out my presentation with, and if there's anything that you can remember from what I have spoken about in the last 15 to 18 minutes, is access to firearms is an important risk factor for intimate partner homicide. When firearms are used, it's 5 times more likely to be lethal, and there are likely to be more victims. Access to firearms is also an important concern when someone is suicidal. Suicidality is an important risk factor for IP homicide, so it cannot be overlooked. So make the connection and ask questions, further follow up. And you have the power to intervene through the core processes. So you're not helpless or powerless. You have the power to take control of some of these concerns where people have access to firearms when they pose a risk to their partner or to others or to themselves. So that's all my time for today. I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. It's been a pleasure, and I will pass the control over to Eva. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Eva Zachary, and I will be sharing highlights from the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee's 2022-2023 findings, specifically looking at the intersections between mental health, substance use, and intimate partner homicide. These findings are meant for learning and prevention. Next slide, please. The purpose of this review is not to assign blame or create stigma. Instead, it's about recognizing patterns that can help us intervene earlier and more effectively. Our goal at the DVDRC and through presentations like this is to build awareness, educate, and ultimately prevent further strategies. There will be no reference to specific cases in this presentation. This will be a high-level review of DVDRC findings on the correlation between mental health and substance use in IPV. Next slide, please. It's important to say upfront that mental health and substance use do not cause violence on their own. However, they can increase risk factors when combined with other vulnerabilities in intimate partner relationships. Something you will notice is that we use the term substance use and not addictions. It is important to make this key distinction. In these cases, substance use was noted as a concern, but not always identified as an addiction. That nuance does matter. Next slide, please. For this presentation, I don't have the time to go into the complexity and intersectionality of risk factors in detail. However, I have put together a handout or a poster on mental health and substance use risk factors in intimate partner violence. The full poster will be sent to all of you with the PowerPoint after this presentation. 57% of the 2022-2023 cases reviewed had a prevalence of mental health concerns and/or substance use. Under the mental health risk factors, depression and anxiety were identified for both survivors and perpetrators. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, survivors tend to show hyperarousal and intrusive symptoms, where perpetrators show more emotional dysregulation. For suicidality, survivors have an increased risk of suicide. However, perpetrators use suicide threats as control tactics. You may have also heard the term of coercive control. This is one of the coercive control tactics. Childhood trauma for both the survivor and the perpetrator increases lifetime risk of IPV involvement. For substance use risk factors, alcohol misuse and/or drug use is prevalent for both survivors and perpetrators. Under survivor vulnerability, as frontline workers, many of you have seen that, be it survivors or perpetrators, do use alcohol and/or drugs as coping mechanisms, which can lead to an exploitation risk, stigma, and barriers to service. It is up to us as a community of service providers to reduce the stigma and provide accessible, welcoming, and trusting environments of care. Under the intersection of mental health and substance use, there is a comorbidity observed where having both disorders can elevate the IPV risks significantly. What we often see in the cycle of violence is IPV worsens mental health, which leads to coping mechanism and then perpetuates IPV. This also leads to barriers to help. Survivors also often lose trust in the system. They fear they will lose custody of their children and then will isolate themselves from seeking the appropriate supports. Which leads us to pathways to prevention and support. Integrated services, protective supports, and policy action. I will expand on these more on the how of this in our recommendation in the following slides. Next slide, please. In this report, we have three specific findings, and the first one is on intersectionality. More than half of the cases we reviewed involved mental health challenges, particularly depression alongside substance use. These factors can escalate tensions and impair judgment, raising the risk of intimate partner violence. This intersection is complex and rarely a single cause. Therefore, there is no one single identifier or risk. Next slide, please. The second finding is separation and history. A striking pattern was the presence of past violence. Over 80% of perpetrators had a history of intimate partner violence, and that could include on their current partner and/or previous partners. We also saw that separation, or the process of separating, was one of the most dangerous times for victims. Recent or pending separation is a clear red flag for increased risk. From a victim services perspective, as that's one of the hats I wear, the first 72 hours after charges are laid or a victim separates or leaves their partner are usually the most vulnerable. Adding mental health concerns and/or substance use in the time frame of high risk is significantly less. High risk can start from a few hours after the separation or arrest to 24, 48 hours. Therefore, early intervention is essential in addressing a victim's safety. Next slide, please. The third key finding is financial stress and missed opportunities. Over 60% of perpetrators were unemployed, and financial pressures added to the instability in already abusive relationships. Another key finding was that many victims and perpetrators had prior contact with professionals, for example, healthcare providers, social services, and even justice partners. Yet their risks were not consistently identified. These were missed opportunities for intervention. Next slide, please. This leads us to our recommendations, and there are 4. The first one is on professional training. We recommend annual cross-sector training for professionals who work in healthcare, social services, justice, and education. Training should focus on recognizing when mental health and substance use are increasing risk in intimate partner relationships. With better awareness, professionals can intervene earlier and provide more trauma-informed, culturally sensitive care. A little tip here is there are often grants that are available for collaboration purposes for cross-sector training. And one example is the Victims and Survivors of Crime Week grant, which was just issued by Justice Canada. Next slide. Next recommendation is public awareness. Public awareness is just as critical as training. Campaigns can help communities recognize warning signs, encourage help seeking, and reduce stigma. We also recommend integrating this education into schools and post-secondary curriculum so young people can build healthier relationships and understand these risks early on. A good example of public awareness campaigns is the Neighbors, Friends, and Family through Western University. It is a campaign with excellent resources. Next slide. Next recommendation is cross-collaboration. We know that no single system can respond to this alone. Health, justice, education, and social services and community organizations must work together more consistently, including experts in mental health, substance use, and intimate partner violence, sitting at high-risk tables with strengthened decision-making and response strategies. My message to you all in this slide is step out of your silos. Trust one another, assist one another. It will save a life. Next slide, please. And the final recommendation is risk assessment. I cannot say this enough. Risk assessments save lives, but only if they are used consistently. Currently, different tools are applied across sectors, and important concerns like depression or suicidality may be missed. Standardizing tools and ensuring all agencies apply them in some way would greatly improve prevention efforts. In the meantime, there are a variety of risk assessment tools to utilize. Please utilize them, and please consult with a victim's community of care. That could be police, children's aid, treatment centers, shelters, victim services, the list goes on. And in regards to confidentiality, keep your dialogue open between community partners when safety is a concern. It will save a life. Next slide. The key message I want to share with you today is prevention is possible. If we strengthen training, awareness, collaboration, and risk assessment, we can reduce intimate partner homicides. That is a fact. Each case represents a life, a family, and a community forever changed, and that calls us to action. Next slide. In closing, I want to acknowledge the victims, families, and communities impacted by these tragedies. Their experiences guide us in this work. Together, by learning from these reviews and committing to stronger systems of support, we can prevent further deaths and create safer communities. Next slide. And to conclude, I'm leaving you my contact information, and as promised, the handout for the mental health and substance use risk factors in intimate partner violence is available to you. It will be shared with today's PowerPoint presentation. And also, for those that want to access it a little quicker, you can go to my website and under resources, find the poster. And I have also written an article expanding the mental health and substance use risk factors and definitions. And you can find that under my blog under September 2025. Lastly, I want to thank you all for showing up today. Your presence shows that you care, that you want to make a difference, and ultimately save a life. I thank you all. I turn it back over to Katrina.
Yeah, thank you so much, all of you, Carolyn, Erin, and Eva, for sharing your thoughts and reflections. I'm now gonna unshare the slides and have some time for us to have some discussion. You can continue to post questions. I really appreciate everybody sharing. I think that this was a nice overview of a number of different areas. So I'm going to start with Erin. And so, Erin, there's been a number of questions that have come in about intimate partner homicide in aging populations. And one of the things that strikes me is that a few people are asking really about the role of kind of the cognitive decline, the health issues that might be more common. Somebody also talked about maybe delusional disorders. I wonder if you might want to start by talking about some of your reflections on those kinds of factors. I know you raised them a bit in your presentation. What else do people need to know?
Thank you for that. And this the good strategy to have me go first because I use my time very efficiently, which, is not common for me. I definitely appreciate the questions. And I want to say to Dawn that I do agree that all the common elements could be applied to other groups, but what my job and my hope today in dealing with a specific population was to suggest these things need to be considered, especially specifically in elder communities. I would agree that health issues, high blood pressure, eyesight, losing your capacity to drive a vehicle in aging communities, huge health issue that really does diminish one's independence. Diabetes, depression, grief as a result of loss of a grandchild, of a child. Um, those have been present in many of the cases in terms of looking at common health issues, but are often not connected and not used in terms of, as Eva was referencing, risk assessment. They're not considered often. They're basically rationalized as these are pieces that are normal within the lifespan. So we're not grouping these together as things that may cause additional stress, may contribute to escalated behavior. And so it's not getting addressed until later. Um, in most cases, like in one particular case, a woman had surgery. She was at home and she was recovering. Her husband had a unfortunate visit to the hospital as a result of a fall, and he had memory challenges, but he was released back into their family home with limited intervention, period, except for the home support that was caring for her recovery in terms of wound care at home. So cognitive decline and other health issues that are realities within the aging community are not often assessed as problematic. They're often overlooked as within the norm. And then I think that the pieces related to intervention are less. If the delusional disorder, very interesting, we had a very specific case where, the alleged perpetrator never ever said that he was solely responsible and talked a lot about the delusions and the conversations and the influences with with his faith um with his faith and with God specifically. And if you look up that case, there was never a time where he was able to actually articulate the steps that he took because all of it was in relation to delusions and to others interfering in his process. Unfortunately, for some of you and asking the questions, it's after that we're able to pull some of this information together to say, wow, we need to think about what we're doing with elder communities and how we're intervening, because a lot of this stuff existed, but we're not assessing it and pulling it together to look at the possible and potential risk that it's creating in a family. Those are my responses to those particular questions. I would also encourage people to look at the Ryan inquest. also a very relevant situation where, again, we underestimate and think of seniors in a particularly fragile construct. So then we don't suspect that any abuser or perpetrator would have brought a weapon in the ambulance to then use when he arrived at the hospital to murder his wife, right? So it is important for us to think about how do we take steps now and learn from these particular cases and tragic losses to think about how we intervene differently with aging communities so that we don't kind of devalue and rationalize what happens when our folks are aging, that we actually with intention and purpose ask the right questions. Thank you.
Yeah, Erin, thank you so much. I'm just going to reflect on what you've just said now and on some of my own kind of reading of these cases as well. It's just, there's just been for many cases just this thing after thing after thing, right? There's a loss, and then there's another restriction, and then there's more isolation, and then there's more health problems, and then when you just think about the pile of things that is coming on top and whether or not people are, as you say, reaching out, thinking about how these might be coming together for folks. And it really opened my eyes to some of the ways in which the multiple factors can start to intersect and create conditions that are really, really hard and that create this risk. So thank you. Caroline, I'm going to turn to you. There's a number of questions for you in our question box. I think maybe what I want to start with is a kind of broader question about integration across services. So, is there, any notification that happens? So, for example, if the courts are doing a protection order, do they send it to police? If there is something that is known to police, if they go out and they do a domestic violence charge, do they check for firearms? Like, how integrated are our services so that firearms are kind of something that the courts are aware of, that the public safety officers are aware of, police are aware of, and so that everybody's keeping track of it? Or is it really left to the people themselves to do that? Flagging of concern?
Thank you for that question, Katrina. So, well, first of all, we know that in domestic violence cases, about 30% of the time, people actually get police involved. And if police are called out for a domestic violence investigation, or if there's concerns of abuse, then yes, they should definitely be asking if there are firearms. We do have a template that officers go through, and inquiring about access and ownership of firearms is on that risk list. So they don't forget about asking about firearms. And certainly they have the right, if someone has a firearm, they do have the right to demand a firearms license, and they can check to make sure that the firearms are stored safely. The reason why I put in the public safety search warrant is because it has nothing to do with criminality. It's just a matter of an interest of public safety. So it's just a mechanism for anyone who has concerns. Again, so maybe the 70% of the other people who have never come to police, it provides a mechanism for them to access police and get police to initiate that public safety search warrant. And it's for mental health or domestic violence or any concerns for public safety. As far as the new enhancement to Bill C-21, records and reporting, it's specific for the courts to notify the Chief Firearms Office. And that's a great thing, because again, I think that a lot of work in the domestic violence space is that we've been guilty of working in silos and not sharing information, and we don't do inherently have done a great job in the past. And that's why part of this presentation, I was trying to impress on people to ask questions about firearms. Don't forget about firearms. Remember that if there's issues with mental health, that there is a nexus between mental health and the use of firearms. So is there an integration? I think it depends on the community. It depends on the strength of the coordinating committees and the law enforcement and the networking that they do within each community. Can we do a better job? Just some places, really do an amazing job, and other areas don't do such a great job at integrating information, sharing information. So it's really, again, it's all about education and awareness, and promoting that there are these mechanisms that are in place to help keep people safer. I hope that answered your question.
Well, yes, and thank you. And I'm glad to hear that, I'm glad to be thinking about some of the ways that this gets integrated. People also have asked, if they initiate one of these processes, if they come either to the courts or if they try, or to the police in terms of public safety, how quickly, how long does it take? How quickly do the applications limit someone's access to firearms? I know that it's going to vary a little bit by process, but
Yeah, and that's a very important question, and it is really important to know. But court processes aren't quick, right? They're a hearing, they require a date, they require, like I said, it's a process. It doesn't happen immediately overnight. Some public safety search warrants can happen quite quickly, if depending on the time of day with the access to the JP. But certainly, if there is imminent, immediate danger, you want to call 911. You cannot rely on any sort of court order, peace bond, doesn't matter. If there is an imminent risk, you call 911 and get the victim to a place of safety if they're at very high risk. So unfortunately, these court orders are not a quick process, but they are a process. And it provides, again, a mechanism for anyone to be able to start the ball rolling and start the process.
Yeah, thank you. And this is a fairly new kind of provision that has been put into place. And I think exactly for that reason, right? So that it's not limited to after something happens, that you can actually get something in place beforehand and anybody can apply. So thank you for emphasizing that. I'm going to ask you one more question before I move on to Eva. And it's going to be a transition one because somebody mentioned that that both of you made good points about suicide's connection to intimate partner violence. And so that there is this link between male deaths by suicide and associated with intimate partner homicide perpetration as well. The question is there any information about female suicide deaths by firearm? And is there any similar association with domestic homicide?
That's a great question, and I have not seen there's been a real lack of research in that area and any statistics that I have seen in relation to that. Certainly just going off general statistics that 8 out of 10 domestic homicide victims are females. Again, men, when we look at firearm licenses, it's men 85% who own firearms. And when firearms are used, again, there's a higher probability that it will likely end in a domestic suicide homicide. And again, in the older populations, we do see there's a higher number of older generations in their context of their relationships where firearms are used to kill the victim and potentially the perpetrator as well. So it's a good question. I haven't, and maybe Aaron and Ava has come across this sort of information in relation to what you asked specifically, but I have nothing really too significant to share in that regard. So I apologize for that.
Yeah, well, and thank you, Carolyn. And I think, I was at a conference recently, and the question about number of suicides as a result of victimization, intimate partner violence victimization, and how, one of the things we haven't done enough talking about is intimate partner violence as a contributor to and as a risk factor to somebody's suicide, because they can't find a way out as a victim, and so I think that that's another interesting intersection to be made aware of and talk more about and assess, which goes us to Ava for a second, and thinking about intimate partner homicide, mental health, and substance use. One question came in was about, are there any specific substances that increase risk for intimate partner violence? Or when they have depression, is there anything, are there any particular things that people need to be most worried about or more worried about?
That's an excellent question. And I will also reference you back to the handout that you're going to be receiving. This is something that you can reference because it is mentioned in there. Um, we it, so I spoke about the comorbidity element where you have depression, where you have you have mental health concerns, along with substance use concerns. And there's not one specific drug that can exacerbate intimate partner violence, but there are certain drugs in combination with depression, and particularly if someone is taking medication for depression, can certainly elevate risk of IPV. And some of those could be stimulants such as cocaine and meth, and they're usually linked with aggression. And opioids and cannabis can contribute to instability. So I hope that answers your question, but please keep in mind there's no one single answer to this. When you're looking at the comorbidity factor, there are multiple elements that can exacerbate intimate partner violence risk.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit more about that risk, because somebody talked about working with a client who's in a domestic violence situation and is concerned about the mental health of their partner. And I can think of many such situations. And then they talk about how, well, the police don't seem to be taking these mental health concerns seriously. And I would often say as well, the mental health provider may not be kind of really on top of the domestic violence concerns. And so you've got this situation of escalated risk, but it seems like, one group is saying, no, this is mental health. Another is just saying, well, I don't, intimate partner violence isn't my thing. Any thoughts around the recommendations and what needs to change so those are better recognized?
Absolutely. When we were talking about cross-sector collaboration, and I touched on confidentiality a little bit, I want to pull that all together because cross-sector, especially, I'll backtrack here. If we're talking directly to the partner of someone who has mental health concerns, and there may be IPV concerns as well, speaking to the partner's community of care, maybe there's a family physician involved, maybe there's a mental health worker involved, having those networks talking to one another to enhance supports are opportunities for early intervention. And I also talked about, and this again goes back to the cross-sector collaboration, is stepping away from our silos. Old school thinking is victim services does victim services work, the shelters do the shelters work, the mental health practitioners do their work. And what we've recognized over many years of research and analysis and learning from victims and survivors and families is that those sectors need to speak to one another, because at some point someone will pick up on a nuance that may be an opportunity for early intervention. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. And so the recommendation would be to try to break the silos down, to reach out and try to get this conversation going. I do see that somebody asked around legislation around privacy, and I just would point people to Ontario's, and this is Ontario specific, but the Information Privacy Commissioner of Ontario developed specific guidance for sharing information around intimate partner violence. And so if you Google that, and maybe one of our folks will Google that and stick it into the chat, there is specific guidance published on that topic. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
If I can touch on this, I was a little reserved to mention this in my presentation, but I'm going to touch on this now because I'm quite sure that we have many frontline service providers present on the call today. And as a fellow frontline service provider, when you're talking about confidentiality and you're worried about breaking your clients' or your patients' confidentiality, keep in mind, and I'm going to speak for myself, I would rather get my hand slapped later on, knowing that I have potentially helped someone or a family get to safety, rather than stepping back in my own personal ignorance, knowing that and my inaction could potentially result in a death. So keep that in mind when, as a service provider, I'm working with the client, but you see that there's some high risk key factors that are present. and you're holding back from either speaking to the police because you have a confidentiality agreement with that client. If you have an opportunity, a potential opportunity for early intervention to get the appropriate intervention services, there's no shame in that. And sometimes we must, especially when there's risk of harm to self or someone else or children, it's our obligation as service providers to call for support. And that early intervention is truly critical in saving someone's life.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, I'm gonna ask a question and any of you can answer it now, because we've been talking, we got mental health and substance use. We talked a little bit about depression and suicidality, talked about sort of cognitive decline and other kind of health conditions. And I think that when we have these conversations, we are at risk of kind of missing out on or not kind of making sure that we consider some of the structural things, structural aspects of violence, like intergenerational trauma, police brutality leading to concerns about relating out to police, stigma associated with, be it aging, be it a mental health or a problem, or substance use, and there's a whole sort of set of cultures and expectations around gun ownership that also feeds into, I think, how people approach this issue. So I think I'm going to pass it to Erin, maybe to start around your thoughts around how do we think about some of these other forms of structural violence in maybe aging populations, and how do we start to think about integrating the findings into our recommendations and practice?
I thank you for that. I think that we really need to establish with intention relationships. I think we need to grow our investment in relationships in order to find ourselves finding common ground so that we can actually challenge the structural barriers that exist where there is a lack of intersectionality or analysis, where we can actually insert those. And one of the things I want to make sure I say before we're off this webinar, is that one of the populations that somebody's asked about in the question is the 2S LGBTQIA community. And I want to be able to say that structurally, the DVDRC has had to revisit how we apply the tools that we have to do an analysis and to do a review of a death when we see 2S LGBTQIA couples and femicides and homicides happening. And so we have to unpack the fact that our structures, often a lot of our structures, are very heteronormative, and where they were created, the language and the words and the structure was really rooted in heterosexual relationships and assumptions related on how violence is perpetrated in intimate partner violence, but that it's related to heterosexual couples. So that's disservice to our 2S LGBTQIA communities, where we know that there is violence happening in those communities. And how do we, revisit and take the time to look at all of the elements that we need to change in the way we approach these particular cases, so that we're more inclusive when we look at including 2S LGBTQIA folks, where we move and look at how we include aging communities, and how do we populate that and have those conversations with police services and other folks and justice partners and other support systems who are working with similar communities. So for me, it's about revisiting, reframing, and being willing to modify how we do things so that we understand intersectionality, we understand the battle with structure, and we are ready to take that on so that we can try and prevent more deaths. Ava, I saw you shaking your head. I'm wondering if you wanted to add to that.
You took the words out of my mouth. I couldn't say that any better. I think something to add is within the 2022, 2023 DVDRC report, there is a section specifically on LGBTQ+ and the intersectionality and there's going to be key findings and recommendations on that as well. There's also, I know there was a question in regards to urban and indigenous populations. I saw in the Q&A quickly. And please know also the DVDRC does have a subcommittee of Indigenous peoples who are academics, frontline workers, advocates, and they're reviewing Indigenous cases that are urban and rural, and also developing risk factors specific to the Indigenous community. So the DVDRC is having ongoing conversations about the intersectionality on the specific themes. Really, we're just getting started. These are the preliminary 6 and 7 in the report that are coming out, and we are building and growing, and we're looking at those intersectionalities.
Yeah, so just to kind of build a little bit on what you're saying, so I guess to talk about sort of, Erin mentioned one of the strategies is to really think about what do our risk factors look like? Do they capture? Another is to actually do focused reviews that are specific to particular groups, so you can actually think about some of these intersections and the recommendations. And then the third is to start to share and bring people in to the recommendations that are specific to individual groups. So, and then as Eva said, we're starting, we've got a few, but there's more to be done in terms of understanding the specific risk factors and prevention opportunities for different groups. I think that there are so many other questions, but I realize that we only have 2 minutes left, so I am not going to be able to ask them, even though I had a whole list of the next ones that were going up on my list. But I just want to then close our webinar, and I would like to thank our presenters, Carolyn, Erin, Eva. Thank you very much for your presentations, your thoughts, and for answering these questions. I would also like to thank our ASL interpreters, Chelsea Freeman and Dan Weeb, and our French language interpreters, Carolyn Napier and Wendy Green. A special thank you to the Learning Network, the Knowledge Hub, and the Family Violence Family Law teams for their behind-the-scenes coordination. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.